what I will be doing this evening will be leading into my class. I'm going to provide a very, hopefully quick, strategic briefing of the political situation as it is right now on this stage of history. From there, we're going to evaluate the potentials that Canada can play in regards to the new renaissance, this new financial order, which will come about if we can avoid a dark age and this one world government bankers dictatorship, which Lyndon LaRouche has been warning about for over 50 years and has been leading the fight internationally to resist by bringing about, protecting, and then advancing on the most advanced Renaissance concepts of human history, starting from ancient Greece, Athens, and beyond. So what I, just as a note here, up until about 2 hours ago, this class was going to be somewhat longer than you will find today. It'll still be very dense, and we're going to go through a lot of history, a lot of subject matter. But as a teaser, I'm cutting it into two parts, so that we're going to end at the beginning of the 20th century, and in an upcoming class, we're going to give part two. That's just a whetting of your appetite. So, to begin the briefing, this year has begun with a lot of potentials. We have currently the real danger of a military confrontation with Russia and China. We have an economic financial disintegration of the transatlantic financial system. And these things are linked, they're not two separate problems. And we have the great possibility for a fusion-based economy and a restoration of the principles that we last actively saw in the United States, Canada, and even in Europe with John F. Kennedy and de Gaulle and the great humanists who actually fought against this Malthusian lobby that's been seeking depopulation and global governance for a very long time. Now, I'm going to begin with a brief video. Not even 20 seconds long.
Довод НАТО таков. Ракетный щит возводится не против вас, а против Ирана.
Вы меня рассмешили. Дай вам Бог здоровья, потому что уже конец рабочего дня, так, в принципе, уже спать пора. Поеду домой с хорошим настроением.
Okay, so what was difficult to read there in the subtitles, the interviewer was asking him, why is it that you are reacting as you are militarily against the buildup of anti-ballistic missile systems around your southern border in Romania, Poland, when everybody knows, the interviewer was saying, this is just to do with Iran and not with you. That was basically the question. So Putin's reply with basically just abject laughter, I think was useful, because most people, and you can see the interviewer was on another world, right? This guy was not thinking strategically. Most people don't realize that the current US and NATO buildup of military systems around Russia are preparation for confrontation, which you wouldn't really know if you were not holding the picture of the world stage right now very clearly in your mind. We've just now moved, for those on G Hangout, onto slide 1. How do I get in the full screen again? Slideshow. So, what Putin and leading generals of the Russian military have been warning about has been that over the past several years there's been an increasing buildup of anti-ballistic missiles with offensive capabilities increasingly set up all across the Russian southern perimeter, like I just mentioned, even going down all the way into Turkey. What we have also with the current buildup of specifically American military systems in the Pacific with Obama's what's called the Air-Sea Battle Plan, there has been a massive buildup in preparation as well for confrontation with Russia's strategic ally, China. This is the key right now, which is defining everything going on in the world. Now you have this happening. It's an ugly thing to think about, and people today think, well, they would never let that happen. The misters, they would never let such a crazy thing happen. But if you actually look at it, right now we're much closer than we were even in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis to an actual nuclear confrontation. This is the voice of Russia, and the Western media, and at this point, the Russian and Chinese media are two very different things when you actually evaluate both on a daily basis. The voice of Russia recently had a leading headline on their website warning that nuclear war now is more likely than ever. Going through how, because of John F. Kennedy in the 60s, the Russian buildup of missile systems in Cuba was mitigated. It did not become a nuclear confrontation, but for several days it was very close. There's been a dozen or so occasions across the period of the Cold War where we did come extremely close, within a hair's breadth, of actually launching a nuclear strike. And people today often think, well, because it didn't happen, it couldn't happen. I think Birgit just left without her phone. Nice try, Birgit. So, because it didn't happen, it couldn't have happened, which is a very simplistic way of thinking about it, because people today neglect the factor of human free will. How do human beings, individuals, intervene into history to change the course of events? And this is the specific thing which today we have to think about doing as well as individuals within a process of history. The danger that the voice of Russia is also warning about is the increasing buildup of nuclear systems that are run by the Saudis in Pakistan and many other nations around the world. The reason why this is a necessary thing to think about is because in the mind of an empire, you have a financial collapse. When the empire cannot control its victims through the economic system, the necessity to introduce a factor of chaos and war to divide and conquer is always necessary, and that's been the historical case of empire going as back as records will take us. The difference between every other point in history where we've had a major war and today is that we're dealing again with nuclear bombs. So, on a negative point, the empire just simply cannot tolerate living in a world where you have progress coming out of Russia, China, and other countries, and a collapsing world order coming out of the transatlantic. On a positive level, well, it's very much just that question of progress. Russia and China are expressing now a commitment towards space exploration, major infrastructure development, as we see with the Move South Water North project coming out of China, which looks very much like Nawapa. Has anybody seen these projects? No? Move South Water North. It's the biggest water moving program in human history that the Chinese have undertaken now. Helium-3 mining of the moon. This is now a national intention by the leaders of the Chinese government towards going to the next phase, which involves now taking the lander that they've just installed there, this rover, and bringing about a multi-phased approach where a full-time moon colony will be designed in the near-term future, and an intention to mine helium-3 for the specific purpose. Well, helium-3 only has one purpose. Right? For those of you who have been on the website, you know that the question of fusion power is the key. So you have a positive application of creative problem solving right now to get outside of a closed system of logic which is driving us into war. And when you look at what's going on in the Ukraine, since that has been in the newspapers but just completely misrepresented, this has nothing to do with the fact that the people of Ukraine just want to be part of the freedom and democracy that's represented by the Eurozone. No, anybody with half a brain has been looking at the Euro collapse and have noted that that is a complete Titanic of a dictatorship which is striving right now to slaughter big chunks of the people living in Greece, Portugal, Spain through austerity, through bailing out of the private banks that have speculated with their national debts. And Ukraine was just another victim country that was supposed to be, according to the European Free Trade Agreement, which was what they rejected, this is what they backed out of signing, in order to work more closely with Russia and China. The conditions of that free trade pact involved destroying their industries, their production, and converting them completely into an agricultural exporter. Right? And this also involves forcing them to cut off many ties with their ally Russia, who is vitally important to them and them to Russia because they are such mass producers of high technology manufactured goods. And to be a sovereign country, well, it's impossible to have any claim to sovereignty if you cannot produce an advanced manufacturing and technological base for your own society. If you're just an agricultural exporter, you're not going to go very far. So this is where the NATO expansion aspect is very important. This has been now underway for a number of years, where countries that have been put through a form of shock therapy during the course of the perestroika in the 90s, where liberalization just raped these countries of all of their production, and it introduced more and more free trade, like Georgia, Ukraine. These countries have been targeted to be absorbed into the whole NATO bloc, and Ukraine was very high up on the list. So had that actually gone through, it wouldn't just be a destruction of the Ukrainian economy, but also, well, as we've seen with the case of Poland, Romania, even the Czech Republic, the installation of the anti-ballistic missiles would have gone in Ukraine as well. And this is what the Ukrainian government has rejected. So the uprisings that we see right now in that nation are not the people as such. When you actually look at who's financing these things, it's George Soros. You're dealing with the most psychopathic speculators of the Eurozone and Wall Street who are promoting massive anarchy across the board for regime change. And that's really, at the end of the day, the issue. So, where is this? And again, you're not going to get this if you're looking at just Canadian press. You really have to take a broader scope. You have to use the LaRouche PAC website. We have to follow this stuff to actually hold in our mind what's really going on, because we are entering a new phase of human civilization. Russia right now has essentially saved the world. Putin has uniquely saved the world at least twice in the past 4 months. First, on the Syria question, right, on blocking the West from blowing up Syria, specifically telling Obama that this is not allowed to happen. It won't happen under his watch, which is the only reason why the bombing didn't get launched after all of the mechanisms were in place. And now the second thing is on the Ukrainian issue and stopping the military buildup inside of the Ukraine. So there is an increased danger, obviously, where leaked documents from an internal dialogue with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the head of the Saudi intelligence, had met with Putin somewhat recently and had threatened him that the Chechenian terrorists who have been running havoc in the Russian Caucasus are controlled by Saudi Arabia, as Saudi Arabia, as we've proven, controls pretty much the entire terrorist international. The Saudi government itself was put there by the British Empire in the 1920s anyway. They, as well as the Israeli government, have been British assets for a very long time. Now, this threat is serious because, as we've proven, as other people working with us have demonstrated concisely, Prince Bandar was also responsible for financing the 9/11 operation in 2001. Everybody is pretty much familiar with this?
28 pages.
28 pages. So this is another aspect of the weak point. On the one hand, this is an increased danger because we know that the Sochi Olympics are coming up in March, and this does put a big target on Russia, and this could be used as a major point to threaten them. The reason why he threatened Putin, obviously, was over the Syrian war issue, right? And he said, look, we can keep them under control on the condition that you let up on blocking the war mobilization in Syria. They put a lot of money, they invested a lot for 2 years in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad and financing terrorist jihadis in the Syrian rebel groups for a very long time. So they're very committed right now to this policy, which is still increasing. And this is, even though you don't hear it in the press every day like you did a few months ago, this is still a key issue. Another weak point to keep in mind is the Iran issue, which has, again, been re-inflamed by this not-so-charming fellow up here named Senator Menendez, who, for the last several months, has been organizing traitors on both sides of the party aisle in the United States to back up his Nuclear Weapons-Free Iran Act of 2013-14. Now, this not only involves putting up major sanctions on Iran, like the likes of which we've never seen before, and also sanctioning partners, people in India or China who do business with Iran as well, which is a form of warfare. You are killing people with these sanctions. But beyond that, this program is occurring in the context of the P5+1 talks brokered by Russia and China for a peaceful resolution of the Iran civilian nuclear weapon systems. And so far as everything we've seen, these things have been advancing with great success. As it stands right now, there is no evidence whatsoever that Iran has any intention for a nuclear weapons program. It's all hearsay and conjecture. It's just the repetition of something which has not been proven, nor is it in Iran's interest to actually do it. So right now, in the context of this peace process, you have this psychopath and groupings of traitors from both sides of the aisle, financed by the ADL, by Wall Street, by London, by the Saudis. The Saudis, by the way, have pretty much put about as much money into buying up Congress members and senators as Wall Street has, into backing up this thing, which has a side effect, includes, and this is a little extract from the bill itself, where on our slide, the author of the report from The Observer writes that this bill includes a non-binding provision that states that if Israel takes military action in legitimate self-defense against Iran's nuclear weapons program, the U.S. should stand with Israel and provide, in accordance with the law of the United States and the constitutional responsibility of Congress, to authorize the use of military force, diplomatic, military, and economic support to the government of Israel in its defense of its territory, people, and existence. So this bill actually reignites the issue of backing up Israel if it chooses, and it says self-defense here, but looking at everything Netanyahu has represented, he is a preventative war disciple. He believes in the doctrine of preventative first strikes. We've seen that by the fact that he's bombed, or he sent the Israeli military to bomb Syrian military bases up to 6 times during the Syrian crisis. You have the assassinations of Iranian scientists, again illegal, the use of terrorists like Mujahideen al-Khalq by the Israelis to assassinate these people. You have, this guy is completely nuts, and on top of that, he is a disciple of the burn the earth doctrine. He actually believes burn the earth.
Scorched earth.
Yeah, like he's like a Zionist version of George Bush, who simply believes that it's man's duty to bring in and usher in Armageddon to bring in the Messiah. And George Bush kind of believes that the only difference is that he believes, along with the neocons like him, that it's man's duty to bring in the apocalypse to bring the Messiah for the second time. So they get along on principle, right? These guys are fanatics. And by binding the U.S. military to back them up, this is pretty much the most stupid thing that anybody could imagine. Now, the weak point in this, as we saw, is the 9/11 issue, that Bandar bin Sultan, and as you mentioned, the 28 pages, cannot keep this secret anymore. And a federal court judge, in the context of the 28 pages that have been classified by the 9/11 report, that deals completely with the Saudi government's role in financing the support base for the Saudi 9/11 operatives that took out the twin tower, or actually the 3 towers that were hit by 2 planes in 9/11. These 28 pages now have resulted in such a clamor in the population in the 9/11 families whose family members were victimized in that operation, that a New York federal court judge has actually now allowed for he's taken away the diplomatic immunity that the Syrian government was given by George Bush in 2005, so that they could not up until now. Saudi. Did I say Syrian?
Syrian.
I'm so sorry. I do that a lot, and just correct me, please. So that the George Bush government had given to the Saudi government in 2005. So now this does allow for the suing of the Saudi government for as many things that can be proven that they have done. And there are many things that are very evil that have been proven. And as you mentioned, these 28 pages will reveal a lot more. And there are resolutions in the House of Representatives to reveal these as it stands, with a lot of support and growing. Which, if you actually put the light on this thing, you're not only going to cut out the danger of a breakout in Syria, because without the Saudis financing the terrorism, there is no terrorism. Without that, there's no safe haven for the opium trade in Afghanistan to be converted into heroin, protected by certain mercenaries like the Canadian military in the Helmand province and the Saudis. Without that infrastructure base, you don't have that. Russia doesn't have anything to worry about in the Southern Caucasus or in the Sochi Olympics without the support of these terrorists. So, and also there's connections with Obama, which are really outstanding, which I'm not going to get into right now. But the question remains now, what's Canada's role in all of this, right? Canada is, after all, an Arctic partner. We are a member of NATO. But we are an Arctic partner with Russia. Strategically speaking, we're one of the biggest land masses in the world as a country is concerned. What role geopolitically are we playing? Are we even playing the role of a country? Now, this is where we have to think strategically here, because Canada could play a very wonderful role in the world, but not if we're not naive about where the policies are really coming from. On December 10th, the Russian military, or Putin, had to announce that the Russian military was going to be increased by magnitudes in the Arctic as a defensive measure against Harper's territorial claims over the North Pole. So on December 9th, Harper just came out of nowhere, where about a year ago, he already announced that Canada wants to increase its its entire landmass by 20% in the Arctic zones. That's the whole territory of Nunavut. He wants to increase that yet more by taking over by saying that the North Pole is also ours. So there's an encroachment again upon Russian territory. Not only that, but you have the buildup of massive military bases. The biggest one of which was just created. I didn't write its name down. Oh yeah, the Canadian Winter Warfare Center has been set up as of this summer of 2013 in Nunavut. Now the way the media tries to claim, spin this in terms of motive is they say, oh, it's part of his northern vision. He wants oil. It's all about oil and money. That's all this is about. Or Santa Claus. He wants to claim Santa Claus as his own, as a gimmick. This has nothing to do with it. In fact, Harper has no northern vision. What economic programs has Harper advanced in all of the years he's been Prime Minister in the Arctic? None. Zip, nothing. No rail line development, no nothing. So that is bullshit. What's actually going on is this is geopolitics, this is a war policy. And the fact that taking all North NATO countries into totality, we recognize that there's not just the danger of an attack on Russia from the south, but also from the north. And Harper has come out aggressively since 2009 against Russia, right? Even warning that the Russians, the big bad Russians, want to steal our sovereignty after a little scientific expedition put a flag down on the Lomonosov Ridge, and completely made a diplomatic issue where there really was none whatsoever, and appealed to a deep-seated fear, a Cold War fear in the psyche that's been put there after decades and decades of nuclear terror from a lot of people. So this has been invoked now. And even when you organize in Ottawa or many places on the streets, what you get as a response from the population is quite startling. People will say, "Oh, but the Russians, they're the bad guys." It's like, all of a sudden, where'd that come from? The Cold War was 20 years ago. How did that all of a sudden?
Bond.
Huh?
James Bond.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Hollywood movies too, right? And it's startling too to look at the scripts of all these Hollywood movies coming out and looking at how many times do we find the Russians are now all of a sudden the bad guys in these movies? This is propaganda to prepare our mind. Increasingly, yeah, but it's been increasing now in the last couple of years. It's yeah.
Yeltsin was a good guy.
I would say that we could talk about that later.
No, they are saying that Yeltsin was
Oh, they're saying it. Yeah, right. Gorbachev is a great guy. Yeah, Gorbachev is wonderful. He was a liberalizer. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So basically, this warfare is taken on two components. You have an aggressive military component, and what's a little harder for some people to see is the economic warfare component. Because what else is Canada participating in? What other economic major policies right now in the context of the global disintegration of the derivative markets of the entire transatlantic? And I mean, this is big. The derivatives sector is up to 20 times more than the actual GDP of the world.
no solvable.
No, it's not. So you have what programs being promoted by the Troika and by Wall Street? Well, what you have is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? A program which uniquely binds all of the Pacific countries into binding NAFTA-like free trade accords, which will destroy any last remnant claims of sovereignty that these countries have left and turn them into essentially feudal serfdoms, except for China. China's actually never been invited into that. All right. So why is China being isolated from all of its trading partners? On top of that, you have CETA, right? Look at Canada. We are currently being pushed through a secretive binding set of agreements called the Canadian-European Trade Agreement. This has been underway for quite some time. Most Canadians don't even know about it. And if this goes through, well, this is going to basically do to Canada what the free trade agreements were about to do to Ukraine, if Ukraine didn't cut out of that. And this binds completely with these massive behemoth monopolies and destroys any protective systems remaining in Canada for the producers or agriculturalists. Meredith.
Sorry, CETA is the drive towards economic union with the European Union?
Yeah, there's something similar in the United States too. There's also NAFTA 2.0, right? An addition to NAFTA, which, as we saw with NAFTA, didn't benefit anybody except for a small 0.1% of the corporate elite, which in themselves, many of whom are getting thrown under the bus as the system is coming down. So this is where people need to really, on the one hand, and they are really, this is the strategic importance of Ukraine right now, because by actually, even though the Ukrainian government is not hot shakes, when you look at the Prime Minister of Ukraine, or was it the President of Ukraine? Yeah. President. Not a good guy. I mean, this guy is not a noble fellow. But when he's faced with the choices of either mass suicide or with the euro, or a chance of survival and development with the Eastern Bloc countries, he's going for the pragmatic choice, which is survival. And Putin is providing a large measure of leadership on this. Right now, you have countries being inspired by that, thinking, oh, we can do that too? You have, for example, Greece. That the opposition movement in Greece, in the parliament, has put forth a measure for Glass-Steagall, a Marshall Plan to break out of the euro, clean up the banking system, and go for a development approach with China and Russia. You have entire chorus in Germany, in Italy, and beyond, saying, well, we don't have to commit mass harakiri anymore. We can actually act on this precedent being set right now, where Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia are forming a different customs union and inviting in many other countries towards a block of development, where the union is not like the NAFTA. The union that we're seeing coming out of this idea is not monetarism. And that's the key. They're focusing on high-tech, advanced long-term thinking and space exploration, nuclear power, and they're moving towards fusion. So this is the type of thinking that is worthy of survival. Like, mankind will merit the claim to being worth saving if we actually re-adopt this principle of long-term creative thinking, thinking outside the box. And there's not a lot of it coming out of major centers in Europe, as we've all seen, or in Wall Street. So what are we doing now in Canada? Well, you have a potential where, with the third biggest city in British Columbia deciding after a lot of organizing to back up our measure and endorse it officially, our movement, as many of you, or I think all of you now know, has been fighting for a global Glass-Steagall, a national banking procedure with major projects like fusion, asteroid defense, and other things attached. NWAPA is a big one on that. The Burnaby City Council adopted and passed our measure for Glass-Steagall and national banking as of mid-December. So we now have many other city councils who have spoken with their representatives, who have understood the real terms of the global situation and what Canada could do, potentially, if we get our heads out of our asses. But you still have a problem in that the population, and that includes the policymakers that we've met with in Ottawa on the municipal levels, are still thinking often too much in terms of a mechanism, right? What detail can change? How do we create more jobs? If we just have more jobs, then we'll be out of an economic crisis. Or if we just, on a weaker way of thinking, if we just print more money to bail out the banks or bail in the banks, that mechanism is going to somehow make things better. Or just cut the budget, you know? I mean, God forbid, not evil people actually are weak-minded enough to think this. That if the problem is the debt. We've overspent. We've been bad. We've been debt sinners. And so if we just tighten our belts, you know, from a 32 down to a 6, we'll just slowly have to make the necessary suffering and pay the debt, and things will somehow get better. And you ask, how's that going to happen? You don't really get much of an answer because they didn't really think too deeply about it. But even for those who are thinking on a much higher level and looking at the right mechanisms, like the mayor of Burnaby, even there you have a certain weakness. Because even if you do have mechanisms like Glass-Steagall in place to cut off all of the bailouts, to cut off all of the derivative gambling debts and flush them as the crap that they are, even if you do that, and even if you create a national banking mechanism which would allow us to provide funds to our federal and provincial governments with other countries to build up job-creating programs, even if these things are in place, and you don't deal with the underlying psychological problems that have been brought about in society over decades since the death of John F. Kennedy, if you don't do that, then these mechanisms will be used in a disastrous way. Right? You can imagine the national bank being used to invest in casinos if people still believe in money. If we didn't cleanse them, if we didn't educate them out of that stupidity, right? Because casinos make money, or windmills, right? Let's create a lot of jobs by covering Canada with windmills. Okay, you'll make a lot of jobs, but the quality of energy is going to cause your civilization to collapse. Oh, but you've made jobs. So there's a deeper problem that has to do with a confidence in the human nature's capacity to make powerful transformative process changes within the earth and beyond the earth and within themselves. This idea of change is a really important idea, which hits at the class that I've been formulating now for some time. This is a more expanded version of a presentation that I had given a few months ago in Vancouver without any slides. So that we're going to take a little bit more time to actually look at some original writings, to actually get into the mind of LaRouche. Because LaRouche has been putting a lot, it's been since Christmas especially, but really since the 70s, LaRouche has been putting a lot of emphasis on mankind's necessity to recognize that human history has been fundamentally governed by a opposing dynamic within the human condition, which has been most clearly expressed with the story of Prometheus Bound, of the famous playwright Aeschylus, whom some of you may have heard of in school or maybe read on your own time. Has everybody heard of the story of Prometheus? Yep. Okay. Who has not heard of Prometheus Bound, or who has not read it? No. Okay. All right. Cool. Prometheus Bound. Well, many people will object. They find this somewhat weird that a political economist, somebody who's been fighting for all of these economic and political changes, would be putting such an emphasis on this mythology. And they say, oh, a response I've gotten a few times, and people have said, oh, but I'm into politics. I'm not into fiction. That's fiction. That's not my interest. I want to know, what do I do? How do I understand what's going on in the world? This is a myth. And LaRouche's point is that, no, this is not a myth, and that you can only understand the dynamics not only of the United States or of Europe or of anybody in the world, including especially Canada, without first going to the lessons that Aeschylus is giving us in this presentation. This was written before Plato, I think about 450 BC. And the story effectively begins with Aeschylus, who's a demigod, who's being locked up, chained up to the side of a mountain by a couple of minions of Zeus. And the reason for his being chained is that he's basically disobeyed God's law, Zeus's law. And Zeus's law was, well, anybody know what Zeus's law was? Olivier?
Well, it was to keep human obey, so the humans obey, so you don't want to permit them to make discoveries, so you want to keep them dumb so they can obey the gods.
Yeah, and what did he steal from Zeus?
Fire.
So Prometheus, well, Zeus was, after one of his drunken orgies that Zeus was renowned for having, he took advantage of his stupor and stole fire from God, from Zeus, and actually gave it to man. And with that, a whole slew of other concepts, because he saw something different in the thing that Zeus treated like a disposable little plaything, a little slave to be treated with contempt and culled. And it says so in the story, and in other stories that discuss this, to be culled whenever they were too numerous. Because without fire, depopulation is always necessary if mankind doesn't develop his mind. So this is a principle of human history. We're going to take 3 sections of the dialogue. It takes the form of generally a multi-log, which anybody can actually go online and read on their own as a whole thing. You can get it done in an hour and a half, 2 hours. So maybe JP, would you like to speak loud so that the people in Vancouver can hear us?
He took his seat forthwith to diverse gods, divers good gifts he gave, and parceled out his empire, but of miserable men recked not at all. Rather it was his wish to wipe out men and rear another race. In these designs none contravened but me. I risked the bold attempt and saved mankind from stark destruction in the road to hell. Therefore with this sore penance I am bowed, grievous to suffer, pitiful to see. But for compassion shown to men, such fate I nowise earned. Rather in wrath, despite, am I to be reformed, and made a show of infamy to Zeus. Listen to the tale, O human suffering, and how at first senseless as beasts I gave men sense, possessed them of mind. I speak not in contempt of men, but I do but tell of good gifts I conferred.
I forgot to mention one thing for those who haven't heard the story. Not only is he being chained to the side of the mountain, but he is now being prepared to receive an ongoing torture for 10,000 years as punishment of a vulture eating out his liver, which, because he's a demigod, grows back by the end of the day to be eaten out again every day for 10,000 years. But as you can see, his attitude right now, when people are coming up to him and throughout this dialogue asking him, just give up, just give Zeus. Zeus will let you go if you just let him know what you know. And Prometheus itself actually means literally foresight, the ability to foresee the future. And Zeus only wants to know one thing that you know, which is who's going to take him down, how's he going to be destroyed. And Prometheus doesn't bend. In fact, you could see he's really in no way all that. He's not really ruining his situation as much as you would think somebody would be, knowing that they would be tortured for 10,000 years. Whereas the people who are watching him don't obviously have the same insight that he does. Continues.
In the beginning, seeing they saw amiss, and hearing heard not, but like phantoms huddled in dreams, the perplexed story of their days confound, knowing neither timber work nor brick-built dwellings, basking in the light, but dug for themselves holes, wherein like ants that hardly may contend against the breath, they dwelt in burrows of their unsunned caves. Neither of winter's cold had they fixed sign, nor the spring when she comes decked with flowers, nor yet of summer's heat with melting fruits sure token, but utterly without knowledge moiled, until I the rising of the stars showed them, and when they set, though much obscure. Moreover, number, the most excellent of all inventions, I for them devised, and gave them writing that retaineth all, the serviceable mother of the muse.
The last one.
I was the first that yoked unmanaged beasts to serve as slaves with collar and with pack, and take upon themselves, to man's relief, the heaviest labor of his hands, and tamed to the rein and drove in wheeled cars the horse, of sumptuous pride the ornament, and those sea wanderers with the wings of cloth, the shipmen's wagons, none but I contrived. These manifold inventions for mankind I perfected, who, out upon it, have none, no, not one, shift to rid me of this shame. I purged the glancing eye of fire, dim before, and made its meaning plain. These are my works. Then things beneath the earth, aids hid from men, brass, iron, silver, gold, who dares to say he was before me in discovery? none I wot well, unless he loves the battle. And in a single word, to sum the whole, all manner of arts men from Prometheus learned.
Thank you. So this was not just about fire, right? Obviously with this comes astronomy, ability to use math, science, mineralogy, pretty much everything that the elites, the Zeusian groups banned from man's use. So the law of Zeus is one, of ignorance, of a fixed system, whereas Prometheus, and this is really almost an economics document, it's a principle of economics, that if you don't invoke the Promethean principle inside of your human society to discover these things of, mineralogy, better ways of organizing your society by using new inventions and technologies, if you don't do that and aren't committed to that in an ongoing way, you're always going to be doomed to get caught into collapsing systems, because there's always only so many resources to go around. As you have more people, or even if you have a constant amount of people, the fact that there is an ongoing necessity to consume resources means that there's a collapse point in your system. The only way to get out of that is to encourage people to start thinking in a creative way and thinking about the future. So if Prometheus is the light bringer, I think one question about Canada is, and this is the job we have to get at in Canada, is in what way has the Promethean principle been expressed? Because we see it in the United States. You could see it more clearly in the United States, and for the historian, especially of Canada, it's treated often as a very dry subject matter of dates, events, plains of Abraham. It's not easy to sort of get your teeth into and get passionate about, right? We never really had, we're actually celebrated for never having had any revolution in Canada. We've always been a conservative, go along to get along with, don't question traditions type of mentality. And that's actually, some people actually celebrate that as being a virtue. Now, I would take question with that, but one of the questions of the firebringer problem, I think, is illustrated very well just by taking a satellite's view at night of North America. Because you're thinking, I'm thinking when I'm looking at this, how is it the case that with one shared body of land, one practically common people, we all speak English, right? We all derive from Europe, but yet with two different cultural matrices that we've evolved in and do very similar structures of land, how is it that the U.S. is lit from coast to coast, especially on the east, but really all across with massive development, whereas Canada looks a lot like, I think, the only other place you see that dark is really like Africa, in terms of the per capita amount of lack of development. Now, admittedly, we're in a much better situation than Africa is, but why is it that with a bigger land, we only have 1/10 of the population, but yet we've been around for about the same amount of time? We only have like 7 major cities strung across, within 40 kilometers of the American border. That's really all it is, and then a little...
80.
Oh, 80, thank you. Okay. So there's something there, right? This is an effect, a shadow of a deeper process. And another question you could ask, and that I was asking myself in formulating this, is why is it that Canada is the only monarchy in the Americas? If you look at all of the Americas, right, north, central, south, they're all republics. Why is Canada the only monarchy? That's weird, right? Well, a lot of people think about this, but it's useful. And it ties into the question, well, what does it really mean to be a Canadian, right? What does your average Canadian actually have as a sense of self-identity, as being we say the words, but is it just, most people just say it as if they're in a beer commercial, there's not much of an emotional, intellectual attachment to the currents that gave birth to the present. It's just not there. But whereas when you deal with an American, often there is a more direct sense of clarity about what America does represent, even though it's not fulfilling its ideals very successfully, as we've all noticed. Regardless, an American is much more in touch with something principled about that system. And, if you haven't noticed it yet, you should organize a little bit and you'd get it. And this brought up an anecdote, because, while I was in British Columbia in the last couple of days I was there, we were organizing at the University of British Columbia, and a history teacher got in a fun discussion with me, and she also observed the same thing, and she was telling me, that, well, you know, she was telling me of a conversation she had just had with one of her colleagues about the Canadian identity. And her colleague, upon getting this question, and she asked the colleague, so, you know, she asked her, what's the first line of the American Constitution? And the colleague actually had an answer. And do you remember what the first line is?
It's we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
Great. Oh, you want to go on?
Establish justice.
Hey.
Provide for common defense.
Okay.
General welfare. Promote the general welfare.
You got the point, right? Her friend had a similar answer, like, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. She had the answer. And then she asked, well, what about the Canadian Constitution? What's the first line? She said, I don't know. And this lady said, of course you don't know. I don't know either. I'm a Canadian. That's the point. And indeed, you know, you ask as many Canadians as I've ever met who have this conversation has come up and the question has arisen, nobody's ever really known.
The true constitution is in England.
Ironically, England really have a constitution? Ah. And this is actually where you get the sophistry, because if you compare it, as you just said, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Beautiful. I mean, clear, not ambiguous. This is a very, very explicit statement of intention for a nation, right? Which does provide a reference point that's transgenerational for people, if they're thinking, to refer to when they're judging what changes are occurring in their lives, right? Is something going against the general welfare? Is there some law that's being changed that is going to be depriving my society and my posterity, those who come after me, of their liberty? If so, then I should probably do something. And that reference point is really important in a culture, especially, well, anyway. Okay, so the Canadian one. Let's just do a little comparative study here. So these are two, on the first page, I just picked out two of the most brilliant excerpts. It begins with a whereas, but so the British North America Act of 1867, which, by the way, people would say is no longer in effect. We do have the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, don't we? And in fact, that's not true. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if you look at the very last article, says that the B&A Act is still in operation, in effect. And for anything not addressed in that charter, it takes care of it, the B&A Act. So you read the B&A Act, like, oh, okay, what does that say? Well, it says that the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And that's the point. And whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. Not the general welfare, the British Empire. So you already have a serious, blatant lack of principle, which kind of slaps you, right? And a couple of lines down, it goes on, it's two more articles, where it says that the executive, government, and authority of and over Canada is hereby declared to continue and be vested in the Queen. There shall be a council to aid and advise in the government of Canada, to be styled on the Queen's Privy Council for Canada, and the persons who are to be members of that council shall be from time to time chosen and summoned by the Governor-General and sworn in as Privy Councillors, and members thereof may be from time to time removed by the Governor-General. Now, for anybody who's read the Canadian Patriot that we've been producing for some time, that's inspiring, eh? Fight for that one. Lay down my life for that. If you ask where are the military doctrines coming from Canada from, where is the policy top-down coming from Canada historically? And one would be struck when you actually look at what's going on behind the scenes to find that nothing really ever comes from the Parliament, not at least in any serious way since Wilfrid Laurier was ousted. And maybe again it came back here or there in bits and pieces when you had good presidents in the United States. We did have a certain goodness that was activated. But really, the policies are generally coming out of the Privy Council office. Just looking at a roster of this thing, from Prince Philip to Conrad Black to Paul Desmarais, who's now dead, thank God, to John Manley, to you name it, Charles Bronfman, to Harper. I mean, you're dealing with the real power structures. This is the branch that takes orders directly from the City of London, not coincidentally the center of world financial speculation. This is one beast. So we have right now a problem where this was happening in 1867, right? What was this stopping? Well, we actually had, and we're going to get at this a little bit later, but we actually had a chance during the period of Abraham Lincoln's victory over the British-financed Confederacy of the South to create, his allies in Canada were very close to creating a strong and independent Canada free of the British influence. And this is something which I'll get at a little bit later, but we actually were very close with the key leader of this grouping as head of the Canadian government for a period of several months, who was ousted, named Isaac Buchanan. And instead of actually attaining a real national independence, we got this. We got in 1867, because when was the Civil War won, right, by Lincoln? When was it over? 1865, right? So the 1867, this is not a coincidence. Lincoln was killed months after the end of the Civil War. His allies were ousted from the Canadian government, and there was a series of measures that involved culminating with a way to keep America, to keep Canada not only from falling into the hands of joining in as states of America, but also the other danger of having them become an actual country, an actual republic. Now, this has been a problem of Canada bending to the will of Zeus again and again. We had a potential to be Promethean, and we bent to the will of Zeus. And we took the easy road, because we were given a certain amount of local liberties that we didn't have prior to this Constitution. And we said, well, let's just not make any waves. So this has been an ongoing problem. And even if you go back to another singular point, I mean, you could say that the Civil War was sort of the second American Revolution, knowing that the first one was in 1776. And you look at, well, what was going on in 1776 and wonder, well, Canada again, well, it was a very different thing than we know today, right? Canada at that time was really just the province of Quebec. That was Canada. Which, this is the basic map that you were looking at after the 1763 Treaty of Paris, where the French lost, the Spanish lost to Britain, and ceded their territories in the Americas to the British. New France basically became Quebec, given to them by the name was given by the British. Rupert's Land was British East India Company Hudson's Bay territory. That's private land. They used the brainwashed big chunks of the natives to also serve their interest in keeping people from exploring too far down into the continent. And then you had the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies, by the time 1776 was rolling around, had been subjected to a lot of offenses. There was a program to just completely crush them through a variety of means, and we'll go through a couple. With all of the similarities in geography, and again, abused people in Quebec who had been spat on and humiliated, why didn't Quebec join as a 14th colony? There was, after all, if you actually look at what was going on, it wasn't an American Congress that had set itself up to declare independence from the British. It was a Continental Congress. That's the name. It was the Continental Congress. You had a delegation led by Benjamin Franklin up in Quebec several times to organize to get the leadership of Quebec to join and become that 14th colony, to stand together to say, well, look, united we either hang together or we are going to hang separately. So why didn't it happen, right? And this is the thing with history. When you look at, again, the reason why Canadian history sucks so much and it's really bland and boring these days is because people fall into the trap of writing about what happened. For anybody who thinks that that's what history is, you're wrong. It's not dates and events. It's not writing about what happened. It's writing about what didn't happen. But then how would you do that, somebody would ask? If it didn't happen, you can't know it. So this is where you have to actually have a sense of what are the principles guiding the process that are shaping the present with an intention to change it, right? If you don't have that intention personally as a historian to actually intervene into the thing that you're investigating, because you are a part of history, we aren't outside of the universe. We're not outside of mankind. So the subjective quality has got to be taken into account when we're investigating with an honest intention to make the future better. So if that's not there, it's going to be really, really easy to just basically treat it in a literal, mechanic, dishonest way, where everyone's got a bias, but what filter are you choosing to look at history that's going to sell your thesis paper, sell your book? Which way is interesting? Is it true? Who cares? It's interesting. That way of thinking doesn't work. So what LaRouche and this organization has been reviving has been a scientific method of looking at what intentions are driving history into a certain direction, right? Why of things that are natural and what and organic in terms of why didn't, like a simple question would be what I just asked. Why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Why didn't we become Promethean when these countries were actually standing up to Zeus? What sabotaged it? I'm planning this as a seed. I'm going to refer back to this, but at first we're going to have to go through some background work before we actually address why this didn't happen. There is an answer, and it will shock you. But we have to address one thing first, because a lot of Canadians would also say, thank God we didn't become part of the Americans. They're imperialists. That's also not true, as you'll get a better sense of if you don't already know that. In fact, it's just the traitors of America who are imperialists. America itself has never been, it's always been anti-imperialist, and has been, in fact, the thing that imperialists have been, it's been the nightmare of real imperialists forever. So, LaRouche has been pointing out that the Declaration of Independence was the culmination of a historical arc that goes back a very long time. And in fact, the British Empire itself was really just the fourth phase of the Roman Imperium. And when you actually look at the inner echelons of some of these families, the Queen's, Prince Philip's family, which they are the same family after all, it is an inbred little hive, these things can go back, and some trace their lineage back to the Senate of Rome. Now, what you have has been a system which collapsed with Rome, but it didn't disappear. The leading families simply went, on the one hand, into some lagoons, right? You had Rome that was broken up into an eastern and a western block in 400, when the barbarian hordes started coming in, and the culture had just decayed in bread and circuses and imperialism to such an extent that they couldn't maintain the system any longer. That's what happens to every empire. So the Rome, you have the western block that sets up, the eastern one sets up a capital in Constantinople. That becomes effectively the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is pretty much running the show, running the banking system, financing things like the Crusades for several hundred years. This is the Second Roman Empire. Out of this, you have a smaller faction who's working as subsidiaries of Byzantium in Venice, who get very ambitious. At a certain point, you have Byzantine is taken head on and subverted by Venice. This is after the Crusades have gotten underway, and Venice now becomes the world center. So the center of gravity moves from Constantinople into Venice. And so now this is... Somebody wants to get there? So what you have here is that there is a migration, almost like what LaRouche would call a slime mold. He says if you really want to understand empire, you have to understand a slime mold. Because it really is not creative. It just sort of migrates, adapts maybe to the environment a bit, but it really doesn't make any qualitative changes. Because if you look at what the empire is doing today and what the empire did in Rome, it's fundamentally the same beast. You're not dealing with different species at all. So there's been no fundamental creativity. What you have had, though, is a reaction against creativity. Right? Human beings are creative. We're problem solvers. We're Promethean. But the empire doesn't like that, so because they have to change. They have to change their behavior, their way of thinking, to react to maintain their control. So what we've had now has been an evolution, even though people come and die, right? There's been many generations. There's been an evolution of an idea which has increasingly come greater and greater into manifesting here on Earth, from simply being an immaterial concept to being an actual base of government. Against the Byzantine Empire, as Rome was collapsing, Byzantium was just forming in this transition period in between, you had a very interesting Platonic humanist named Augustine of Hippo, who became a saint later. And in his On the Free Choice of the Will, he's from North Africa. And on this free choice of the will, this guy basically takes the lead in representing the Promethean principle as an individual. He says, we're going to take on the entire debauchery of the Roman Empire, its use of Christian forms, but just as a way to costume pagan practices. We're going to take this head on in principle and actually give people a chance to judge for themselves as people, as citizens, what are the laws of the world and what are good laws, what are bad laws. And as a section from his work, and part of this, he writes this to actually give people a sense. He's tackling this paradox of predestination versus freedom, right? If the universe is ordered by law, I'll just stand here for a second so you guys don't read that. If the universe is ordered by law, right, and we're products of the universe, and this is a problem that I'm hoping most of you guys have thought about a little bit. Thank you. But I'm covering it for a reason. I don't want you guys to look at it yet. If that's the case, then aren't all of the decisions that I could possibly make already predetermined, just like the orbits of planets around a sun? Or as people probably back then thought, as the sun around the earth, right? Isn't that the case? So how do you reconcile how we could have the existence of freedom in a world of order, in a universe governed by law? What type of law is it if that's true? Because by virtue of us having a rational discussion, it means that there must be some order happening, because you can receive qualities of words that I'm using. I can shape, thoughts in my mind that I can try to communicate back and forth. So we can, we definitely can't ignore the existence of both, but how do we reconcile them? So now I'll get out. He writes, "It is from this eternal law that men have derived whatever is just and lawful in the temporal law. Eternal law is impressed upon our nature. Thus, when reason or mind or spirit rules over the irrational movements of the soul, then that is in control of man, which ought to be, by virtue of that law which we found to be eternal." What do you guys think of that? Pretty good? Meza, question? Okay. So this is, he's basically reviving.
It's, it's not,
Speak
it's not
loud.
obvious what he's saying there.
No.
It's sort of a teaser
Mm-hmm.
to get you to think about some sort of paradox in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because in the course of this, and he's writing this as a Platonic dialogue, he's introducing the fact that there are observable two states of existence. You have the changing state of existence, the world of matter that we see around us, which is always becoming. It's never in a fixed state. Things are getting better, or getting worse, they're decaying, or they're growing. But it's changing. Everything you could see with your senses is changing. But then you got another state, right? You got the state of things that aren't changing. You guys think of an example of something as a concept that doesn't change? It's not of the state of matter, simply. Hypothesis.
Justice.
Okay. But your idea of justice can change, right? But you have an idea of justice that you're dealing with. You had a thought?
I just maybe gravity.
Well, that could be argued. You can.
We don't even know what the gravity is.
Yeah, you can argue that. You can maybe make the argument that it's the gravity, whatever this is, that keeps things coherent, might be the case in this part of the galaxy, but on another part, you could say maybe you could make the argument that it's not the same, right? I don't agree with that, but still, you could make that argument. You could say it's not. You could say it's not universal, right? You couldn't just jump and say that that's universal, right?
We know how it works. We don't know what it is. What causes it?
You could say that.
You ask for a principle that doesn't change.
Yeah, that doesn't change, right? But you said a principle, right?
Principle.
A principle, yeah, fundamentally, a universal principle.
Universal. That
Yeah.
universal
truths. 1 + 1 = 2, no?
The principle.
Sure, but one positive and one negative doesn't mean you've got, because you could add a quality to the quantity, right? And all of a sudden, you 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 anymore. It could be neutral, right? Negative 1 plus 1.
It's like,
But all let's say, yeah, universal truths, right?
yeah, yeah.
Right. And so you can think of a time when there was, you can imagine, your imagination can create a world that in your head had nothing in it, right? Just the absence of something. But it's really hard to think of, and doesn't mean that it existed, but it means you could think of it. But you'd be really hard pressed to try to imagine a point in time where there couldn't have been an idea of a square, right? As a concept, right? Some concept that has certain quality. What was the time before which there was square, right? It's hard to think. You can't really think. It slips out of your mind every time you try to think about something like that, or equality or justice. But you have these two levels. And what he's saying is, as the mind escapes the trappings of the senses, which are constantly in flux, and grapples more and more with these ideas that transcend the simple limitations of the senses, it can rule over the, what does he say here, the irrational movements of the soul, right? The hungers, the desires that are not always necessarily beneficial to the whole that we're a part of, right? We've got all sorts of, this idea of the vice and the virtues, right? How to increase the degree of intensity of our love of virtue and at the same time be more disgusted by those vices that were keeping us from those virtues, basically, right? So you're actually being able to grapple now with this idea with an ability to judge good laws and bad laws. Because that's the question. What is a legitimate law and what is an illegitimate law? And how does a people become cultivated enough to be able to themselves as sovereign individuals make those types of judgments for the whole that they're a part of? Otherwise, what's democracy ever going to be? It'll always be a joke if people can't think that way. So this was against Byzantine. Now, when Venice had taken over Byzantine's lead in destroying things like the Islamic Renaissance, which was the expression of the Promethean principle in a bright way in the 11th and actually 9th, 10th centuries, I think, is where it was concentrated. The Islamic Renaissance that was concentrated in the before that? Yeah? Okay. So when that was the center of world discovery in medicine and science and arts, that was smothered by what? The Crusades. Right? Who was financing that? Byzantine and Venice. When Venice took over, at this point you had the creation of the biggest economic collapse that at that point humanity had ever seen. The banking houses of Bardi, of Peruzzi, of Italy had gotten into the biggest speculative bubble in history. So speculation isn't a new thing. This goes back some time. When a default happened in a kingdom of, I think, England at the time that couldn't pay the wool, basically a whole chain reaction set into motion where nobody could pay the obligations that were due them, and the whole system went into an economic collapse. Our documentary, The New Dark Age, goes through that, which all you guys should check out if you haven't watched that already. Now, in the context of this dark age, where people, it's dark for a reason, people weren't coming up with a lot of new ideas. Religious fundamentalism, cults, all of these things basically took over, and people's view of the universe became really small. It was just, that's what happens. Wars were prevalent everywhere, and in the context of this, you have a guy named Nicholas of Cusa that revives the Augustinian tradition, that revives Dante Alighieri, who's doing similar things to Monarchia, and takes it to yet a still higher level when he writes in his Concordantia Catholica, and he, by the way, is the guy that actually organized the resolution of the war between the Eastern and Western Orthodox churches that had been taking over all of Europe at that time. And this young guy comes out on top of everybody and founds not just a modern physical science, but also a modern form of statecraft, based upon certain discoveries that were made by Augustine and Plato that he upgrades. So the concept then that he tackles against the Venetian control is that, and he writes, all legislation is based on natural law, and any law which contradicts it cannot be valid. Hence, since natural law is naturally based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. For if by nature men are equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler who is their equal in power cannot be naturally established except by the election and consent of the others, and law is also established by consent. So this is a really big idea for a period where the Renaissance has barely even begun yet, right? This idea that that people are actually, like this idea that there's something in people that make us equal, that's not self-evident. Especially in that time, but even today, like that's not, materially speaking, that's actually the most untrue thing you could think of, because everybody in this room is all different, right? Physically speaking, we got different talents, got different heights, got different colors, we got different, so many things separate people, right? But he's actually saying that there is something that establishes us as having an equal claim to the idea of equality. Even the ruler, he's reducing the kings at the time to this standard, and that could get you killed. Not only that, he's saying that your authority is derived from the consent of the government, and that's also a big idea. But he goes on in the same work. He writes, all legitimate authority arises from elective concordance and free submission. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that all authority, which comes from God and as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of the subjects. Free election based on natural and divine law does not originate from positive law, nor any man upon whose will the validity of the election depends. Right. So whereas the Queen, who bestows upon us certain liberties by giving us a constitution, cannot equally take them away, because in the world of British contractual law, there is really just, the law exists by the monarch. The sovereign, there's not a sovereign people, there is a sovereign, right? And the authority for the laws emanates from the will of the sovereign. It's perfectly in chain. But so they're saying here that's not the case. That's positive law. That's different. So again, the distinction's coming back. It is the common opinion of all the experts on the subject that the Roman people can take the power to make laws away from the emperor because he derives his power from the people. When they order something contrary to a divine commandment, it is evident that the command does not share in the divine rulership, and so one should not obey it. No one is obliged to observe an unjust law, and no living person is exempt from a just one. What do you guys, any thoughts? Yep. So he does though say that this is contingent upon another quality, because if the people themselves, like we were talking about earlier, if the people themselves are more obsessed about their personal personal pleasures over the well-being of the whole, if they don't have a conception of the whole that they're a part of, this doesn't really work anymore. Their authority is thus negated because their decisions are no longer in tune with reason, which is the basis of natural law. So it's very unreasonable for people to start making broad generalizations based upon something which is their personal bias, right? If they haven't thought about, like for example, I like doing cocaine, so thus everybody should have the freedom to do cocaine. I don't hurt anybody, so thus it should be internationally legal as long as you don't hurt anybody. If you say that, and people do make that argument, but when they're talking about drug legalization, they're talking about weed, they're talking about the whole thing, because the whole thing is controlled by the same banks anyway, and HSBC, JP Morgan, and the British. So when they're talking about legalizing one drug, they're talking about fundamentally legalizing all drugs. But when they make that argument, these libertarians, or these Milton Friedmanites, this is unreasonable. It's not based on natural law, right? Or open up your borders to free trade. Even, and Ukraine's like, well, that's going to destroy us. You're going to not let us sustain our population. We'll do it anyway. It's the law. Well, no, is that really the law? Right? It's the law of monetarism, but is that really the law? So again, right, you're giving people an ability to actually judge what is a legitimate or illegitimate law based on looking subjectively at their own powers of reason. That there's some quality that we all have to self-reflect upon how our minds think when we're reasoning through a problem. Right? That's important, the subjective and the objective. We should never separate these two worlds. So this is the thing today with Glass-Steagall again, right? People will say, oh, but you hear Wall Street almost as an echo in the background. You can't do that. That's against all of the rules of globalization. Glass-Steagall, that's against everything we do. That's against the law. It's like, well, what Hitler was obeying the law. He made them. You just legalized stealing and killing. Does that mean you're following the law? So Glass-Steagall is actually an expression of divine natural law from this higher standpoint. You're saying it's illegal to steal and kill, effectively, in the simplest way, right? This is not some regulation. So,
Today we are closed.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the thing too, right? You look at all of the support this thing has. This does scare the empire. This is the other weak point that I didn't even mention in my briefing, and I should have. But it's not just 9/11 and exposing the Saudis. This is Glass-Steagall has a huge amount of support in the U.S. Congress. We've got this thing that could happen immediately thereafter in Canada, and you've got governments in Europe that are far advanced on this. So this is the way to take down the empire. Now back to the point here is that we've got this wave of ideas. It's the same concept, but it's being made more clear as generations proceed and as Well, as Prometheus is expressing his nature, I don't want to make it seem like people are possessed by this demon Prometheus, but as this principle is more concretely expressing itself, we have 1776. And I've skipped over a lot. There's other points that are really worthwhile, but you know, we only have so much time. So the original question, why was Canada not participating as the 14th colony, right? So what exactly were they rejecting? What were the original Quebecois? I think there were 80,000 at the time. It was a huge amount of people in Quebec. Why did they drop the ball? Why did we submit to Zeus instead of going with Prometheus? Well, the Declaration of Independence, I think, is pretty clear. Can you make out the writing, or is it too small? It's very small. Can you make it out?
The U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776.
Louder so people can hear it.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when the long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Okay. So it's the revenge of Cousin and Augustine. So when Cousin and Augustine were writing, the ability to actually act on those discovered principles of judging good and false laws was not yet there. There were no nation states yet, right? You still had baronial fiefdoms and serfdoms. So they couldn't actually see it shape the legal system of an actual nation, a constitution. So here we actually have the first time a government was set up with this principle, that there are truths that are held to be self-evident, that are men, not only that are men created equal, and that are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that governments, that's the cause of governments, that it's that principle is the reason why governments are there. Thus, any government which is infringes upon the ability to actualize those principles in every person loses its authority. And a revolution was fought to establish and defend that discovered principle. So why the hell would any people in their right mind, especially those who had been abused by the British Empire like the Quebecois had for so long, have rejected that principle? Oop, sorry. Now, to get at that, we have to look at some of the, because under the Declaration of Independence, there's a list of what are the names of those intolerable acts? That's it. Intolerable acts, right? So you have this beautiful statement of intention, and then I think something like 20 some odd intolerable acts that the British have committed to destroy the people of the Americas. And people say, oh yeah, you guys remember what their major grievance was? Remember what it was? Taxes. Actually, that was number 17. But that's the one that's popularized, right? So people think, oh yeah, they fought a revolution they didn't want to pay taxes anymore on tea. That's why they had a tea party. No, so that's that blows a lot of people's minds. That there's actually that was one of the least that was big, but it wasn't one of the top concerns. Before that comes such things as for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing tax, and that's exactly what free trade is done. That's what the TPP, that's what CETA, that's what the Ukraine free trade agreement would have done. It would have cut them off of any chance to work with any Russia or China country, right? For imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, Guantanamo Bay, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Actually, that's Guantanamo Bay. And but to get to the question that we were first hitting at, which is why didn't Quebec join, right? That system, even though Benjamin Franklin was here at Chateau Ramsey in the old port, staying for weeks organizing. Why did this not work out? For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. So, what he's referring to is the Quebec Act of 1774. That was the act by the British government to basically bribe the Canadians into staying loyal to the crown. You guys all heard about the Quebec Act of 1774? Some of you have, yeah. So what you're dealing with here, this is what the Quebec Act did. You still had the Hudson's Bay Company. That didn't really change. Quebec becomes all of this. This whole region now is all of a sudden Quebec. These are the colonies from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia. These are Indian reserves. They didn't really change too much, except that most of them became Quebec. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland are still colonies of the Brits, which had their own. Actually, there's a story there, but anyway. And actually, that's Florida, but that's still British colony as well. There's probably a story there to be told, but I just don't know it. Here's actually another way of looking at it. Before the Quebec Act, so this is in 1773, the province of Quebec was really just this, right? So from the Quebec Act basically establishes a complete encirclement, right? Oh, it's right here. This is it actually. So the complete encirclement, and it says that not only will we give you all of these other territories, but what we're also going to do is give you all of these progressive rights to control your own local legislation. You know, local control. You're gonna have religious, different types of religious freedoms that you won't have to. You can just keep your Catholicism. In fact, we're gonna let your seigneurial system come back. We're gonna get rid of what we had in the English legal system. We're gonna allow you to have the seigneurials basically just feudal territories, and we're gonna allow the priests to have complete control of the purse. So we're gonna allow basically for an environment of corruption. But what you're gonna do, you're gonna get all of these things, all of these local control things, as long as you just stay away from Benjamin Franklin. And not only that, if that doesn't work, so that some people still after that still wanted to join the American Revolution. They still read the Declaration and were still inspired. So they said, just in case that doesn't work, they organized to get all of the churches to essentially send you to hell. So you will be excommunicated and burn in fiery brimstone for eternity if you join the American Revolution. So, sadly, for the most part, this actually worked.
They were not allowed to form their own government.
No, they just had local control. They still had to be obedient to the crown.
That's it. So
Yeah.
You're not free.
No.
You're just sitting here.
Yeah.
You're a colony again.
Exactly.
Kind of, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's a pretty good letter to the inhabitants of Quebec. Actually, I wrote 1776. It's actually 1775 by the Continental Congress, who makes one last appeal to these people to say, just break with them. And I figure it's worth it, because we are here in Quebec after all, to actually read this a little bit and get a feel for it. Yeah, we can read that. So it's written, these are the rights, and this is an excerpt, so there's already been a listing of a bunch of rights that they have granted based on their fact that we're all humans and we all have the equal rights by being born of a common creator. And he says, well, these are the rights you are entitled to and ought at this moment in perfection to exercise. And what is offered to you by the late Act of Parliament in their place? That's the Quebec Act. Liberty of conscience in your religion? No. God gave it to you, and the temporal powers with which you have been and are connected firmly stipulated for your enjoyment of it. If laws, divine and human, could secure it against the despotic caprices of wicked men, it was secured before. Is the certainty and lenity of the criminal law of England and its benefits and advantages commended in the said statute and said to have been sensibly felt by you secured to you and your descendants? So were the laws that were so-called given to you from the English common law, were they actually given to you and your descendants, your posterity? No. They too are subjected to arbitrary alterations by the governor and council, and a power is expressly reserved of appointing such courts of criminal, civil, and ecclesiastical jurisdiction as shall be thought proper. Such is the precarious tenure of mere will, by which you hold your lives in religion. The crown and its ministers are empowered, as far as they could be by Parliament, to establish even the Inquisition itself among you. Have you an assembly composed of worthy men elected by yourselves, and in whom you can confide to make laws for you, to watch over your welfare, and to direct in what quantity and in what manner your money shall be taken from you? No. The power of making laws for you is lodged in the governor and council, all of them dependent upon and removable at the pleasure of a minister of the crown. We defy you, casting your view upon every side, to discover a single circumstance promising from any quarter the faintest hope of liberty to you or your posterity, but from an entire adoption into the union of these colonies. Seize the opportunity presented to you by Providence itself. You have been conquered into liberty if you act as you ought. This work is not of man. You are a small people compared to those who with open arms invite you into a fellowship. A moment's reflection should convince you which will be most for your interest and happiness, to have all the rest of North America your unalterable friends or your inveterate enemies. The injuries of Boston have roused and associated every colony from Nova Scotia to Georgia. Your province is the only link wanting to complete the bright and strong chain of union. Nature has joined your country to theirs. Do you join your political interests? For their own sakes, they never will desert you or betray you. Be assured that the happiness of a people inevitably depends upon their liberty and their spirit to assert it. The value and extent of the advantages tendered to you are immense. Heaven grant you may not discover them to be blessings after they have bid you an eternal adieu. So that was a bit of a fail. So they caved. They submitted to Zeus. They didn't allow the Promethean better side to express itself. And Canada was really ravaged. Commentators of the time are amazed at the lack of development in the 50 years that follow this, the American Revolution in Canada. There was just complete stagnation, constant economic decay, no development, whereas in the United States, you actually had the application of a national bank, a high protective tariff that came out of Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, and the population prospered. You had manufacturing set up, you had industry set up, the development and control of man's mastery over nature. These things were increased to such a degree that the population quadrupled in the United States and remained stagnant in Canada. New cities were formed, the likes of which we'd never seen up until that point in America, not so in Canada. Because of why? Well, on the one hand, we'd always been forced to submit to this, to free trade that goes with this, right? That's the law of Britain. Every colony gets free trade. Except for Britain, they always get to use the protective tariff, so they don't follow their own traps. It's like the casino manager doesn't go into their own casino to gamble. So it took a while for reality to hit these people over their heads a lot, but finally it did come about. You know, Canada actually did have a certain expression in some form of the Promethean spark. I'm sure most of you have heard at least the rebellions of 1837-38. Yeah. So Louis-Joseph Papineau, William Lyon Mackenzie, we're told that these two things happened completely in isolated ways. It was just a coincidence that they both occurred at the exact same time in the same year. But really, it was just, that was all. It's a coincidence. Well, that was one rebellion, that was another rebellion, and they just so happened to have occurred at the same time. No correspondence between, So it took a while, but it finally happened. So Louis-Joseph Papineau was a minister in the legislature of Quebec who was he was a complete Republican in spirit, and we're going to get at that. William Lyon Mackenzie was sometimes a little bit more confused, but generally a fiery guy who was the first to really take on the family compact, this British-run oligarchy that had set itself up during the War of 1812 in Canada to control the churches through the Anglican Church, as well as the economy, and everybody who was anybody was basically part of the upper echelons of this family compact. And they call it that because they were trying to model their system on the rights of hereditary authority of Britain, right? But it was just new blood. Mostly composed of loyalists and British immigrants. So this didn't really work, though. So this guy, both of them waged a certain rebellion. It was subverted both from Britain, from places like the University of Toronto, which was then King's College, set up by the head of the family compact, by the Orange Men, the Orange Order, which were set up as a Masonic order modeled on William of Orange, who took over Britain from the Netherlands 100 years earlier, and America. So you actually had some American...
That's strange, because Papineau was a Masonic...
Oh, I said Orange Order. So was Benjamin Franklin. So was Marquis de Lafayette. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there actually were still, even then, certain humanist elements within the Masonic sects which were actually against the oligarchical factions. Today, at this point, it's pretty much just the oligarchical factions that exist. But then it wasn't the case. Mozart was...
So that explains George Washington.
Yeah, exactly.
Until Franklin and Roosevelt.
Yeah, even Edgar Allan Poe.
Because he was a Masonic too.
Yeah. So that's the thing. You this has been squashed though at this point in those orders, but that's part of history. Now, these were subverted by what I didn't mention was there were a lot of pro-British elements at that time coming to prominence in the United States. So they ran the rebellions assuming that they were going to get backed up by the USA. Now in 1837-38, though, the problem was the USA was no longer itself. Andrew Jackson had just destroyed the Second National Bank. This guy had given Wall Street full power over controlling the economy. Britain, he gave the slave owners, he basically killed the Cherokee to empty out the land in the South to give it all over to the slave owners. And that's what created the whole South-North slave-free system of division. And after him, his replacement was, the replacement of Andrew Jackson was,
That's good.
anybody?
Which year?
I just have it on. Oh, it was wasn't it the finance minister, the treasurer?
Wow, just completely moment. So anyway, his replacement was even worse. And the U.S. basically, under the leadership of these Anglophile pricks, left the Patriots hanging, and in fact, most of them hung. But to give you a sense of Papineau's intention, because again, the intentions of these guys are completely slandered these days. Nobody can really get a sense of why do they do this. And on a trip to Britain, Papineau writes in his memoirs, he writes of a dialogue that he had with Lord Bathurst, who was one of these high-level British Foreign Office operatives who were trying to get him to change his stance and to be a part of the aristocracy, the family compact of Canada. And he writes a quick, he writes the dialogue in his memoirs. And now as Lord Bathurst is speaking, Lord Bathurst had begun by saying, this is after they were suppressed as rebellions. It says, as a statesman, I foresee and predict before the end of this period great conflicts between the various parts of the American Confederation. England would then be ready to grant the colonies which would have remained faithful to her and their independence and institutions better than those which are based on the Federative Pact. Indeed, released from any counterweight, democracy would be impetuous and anarchistic, while it would be the best of all possible governments if it were moderated by a hereditary magistrature, whose perpetuity would be ensured in its glare and its strength by the means of majorates and substitutions. It is clearly understood that the English government would grant these majorates to influential men like you, sir, if they wanted to take part of such a wise arrangement. By giving your support to this plan and by making your compatriots welcome it, you would hasten the era of happiness and power for your country. We would attract in it the rich families of England, which are friends of hereditary institutions, and those rich families of the United States who are disgusted by the weak influence which the democratic ascendancy leaves to them.
The date you put is when it was published, or around that time. But that's in 1824.
Oh, it was published and then it happened earlier. Ah, okay, good to know. Okay, so it was 1820 something then. Good. So this is before the rebellion. Oh, I'm learning something new. Okay, so Papineau then reveals his response to Lord Bathurst by replying, I answered Lord Bathurst that my utopia differed from his and appeared to me all at the same time to be more desirable and more realizable, that the American Confederation would in the future be one and indivisible, that it appeared to me to go towards aggression and growth, aggregation and growth, rather than towards mutilation and impotence. That on the day of our independence, the right of common citizenship and free trade between Quebec and New Orleans, Florida, and the Hudson's Bay would ensure Canada an undetermined but long period of peace, conquests on nature, progress in moral, political, and industrial sciences, with individuality for each sovereign state under the protection of the Congress, which could not become tyrant, having neither subjects nor colonies, and having attributions only in questions of peace and war with foreigners and foreign trade. Language isn't too high level, you guys.
It's a lot less. The threats in Bathurst's letter, they're like
subverted. Yeah,
peace and happiness.
Yeah, right.
Like this, it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
Like veiled threats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have a clear understanding of these two opposing principles of systems, right? The British and the American system, and which one he sees is the most reasonable to put his cards behind. But then, and this actually adds to the drama, I guess, now that I know that it was written before the Revolution. He actually, it's a gamble, but it's a reasonable one. And the fact that John Quincy Adams had just been jettisoned from the government a little bit before this is a tragedy of history. But regardless, this is an expression of the Promethean principle in some form coming out. What happens as a response to these revolutions, or attempted revolutions? Oops. Well, you have what's known as there's been sort of several successive constitutional sort of reforms in the Canadian history. From 1774 to 1791, there was another sort of legislative maneuver. To 1840. 1840 was called the Union of the Americas, the Union of Upper and Lower Canada. Sorry. This was set up by this guy named Lord Durham. Yeah, thank you. Durham was a guy who was sent in by the British Foreign Office, a friend of Bathurst, and he was sent in to figure out what the hell is going on. Why are you losing control of your colonies? How do we not let this happen again? And so he sets up a royal commission effectively and figures out that, well, he puts a few things together, and he basically says, well, look, we can't get rid of all of the problems. He does make measures to try to destroy the French culture. That's one idea. Another idea, though, is to create this idea of the Upper and Lower Canada unions of the lower and upper parliaments, but with it turns out to be very unequal rights to each. The French really get screwed over there. But more importantly, his sleight of hand is that he says, well, look, this nationalism, this republicanism, we can't just destroy it, but what we can do is rechannel it towards responsible government, right? So instead of actually fighting for an independent Canada, we're going to try to get all of these patriots to fight for begging Britain to just be more responsible with us. And that'll be the clarion call of all patriots. We're going to just move it towards responsible government. And that became repeated and repeated. And a lot of people, including William Lyon Mackenzie, got sucked into this type of sophistry. Now, they couldn't fully stop it, though. Because throughout this period, nonetheless, you did have people like this is one of the most important representatives of the school of Henry C. Carey, who's Lincoln's advisor, his economic advisor, who fights throughout the Civil War to establish the real American system in America against British free trade. And his whole life is devoted towards not just making America free of British free trade and reestablish the Constitution in that form, and that means national banking, the protective tariff, but more importantly, the idea that money has no value. That what has value is the ability to increase your powers of production through discoveries and inventions. So that's where government is really, that's why you have government. That's the general welfare. If you don't do that, you're not being creative, then the general welfare means nothing. You're always going to get sucked into a closed system where resources will deplete and you're going to go towards a collapse. You'll have to become an empire, effectively. So this was more generally understood. This is somewhat alien for people in our generation because we're just not exposed to these ideas. But this was the topic of debate in the newspapers, in the political structures, and he was the leader of it. And he was the leader of the Henry C. Carey faction in Canada, Isaac Buchanan, who literally, during this course of the Civil War, the British had expended so much of its resources on trying to destroy America while running the Opium Wars in China and doing all of his other dirty tricks to kill off Indian people. It had spread itself so thin that it was going bankrupt. And it gave a chance for the American system people in Canada to rise to great prominence. So Isaac Buchanan becomes the president of the executive of the Macdonald-Dorion government in 1864 in April. Yeah, in April. And this guy is unleashing the biggest investments into canals, roads, schools, hospitals, you name it, he's doing it. And he's doing it with the help of Americans who are fighting the same battle against Wall Street. And he's got a grouping of people around him who are, they're also investing in things like scientific discoveries, integrating new discoveries as quickly as possible into the production process. Henry C. Carey is known for many things, but I think just to give a cross from his own writings, just to give you a sense of where he stood on the British and American system, to make it clear where Canada was actually looking towards in this period of the Civil War of America. Henry C. Carey is making the point in 1856, before the Civil War has begun, but people then know that it was almost inevitable, that two systems are before the world, not just America. One looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all. Right? So this means here, British free trade, you're looking at increasing the proportion of persons and capital engaged in trade and transportation. So after something is created, you can trade it, you can move it, but you're making so many people focused on moving and trading the thing that was created that there's less people who are actually creating things. So the rate of people in manufacturing is being depleted under this policy. As you can see, Wall Street or the financial sector today, or the services sector in Canada, right? If you just look at how many people do we know in Canada are employed in services versus production, it's like 80% services, right? And like 20% are actually less in production, productive things. It was the inverse 50 years ago. So that's British free trade, that's globalization. And that has always been the case, every time it's been applied from the 1500s to the present. Now, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities, the creating of new things with which then you can trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other, the American system, looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital good profits. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other in increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Pretty good. So this American system is the key. It's not a question of communism versus capitalism. That's a false debate. It's are you living in a world where you look at money as being what gives value to things, or powers of thought, of the ability of human beings to think creatively, to change nature in a way that allows us to free our minds up from being beast of burden on the field. Because a machine, as anybody who's looked at this would tell you, a machine, if it can do the work of 100 men, allows these 100 men now to not have to work 12 hours a day and not use their minds. They can now become scientists, doctors. And this is what the Confederate South didn't want to accept. They didn't want to use machinery. They didn't want to use protection, because by using British free trade to export cotton to Britain, they could just keep on using more and more slaves from Africa. That's all. Just work them harder, right? Increase production by working them more. Don't increase it by introducing a new technology. And so Henry C. Carey was against that, and he understood it. And so did Isaac Buchanan. But the problem was Isaac Buchanan's enemy, this guy George Brown, who ran the Globe, which today is known as the Globe and Mail, he pretty much ran a coup with a grouping of other people who were also enemies of Buchanan, like Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And Buchanan fell in June of 1864, so he was only in there for 2 months. He got a lot done, but it was only 2 months. And his enemy, George Brown...
He was in power for only 2 months?
In that position of office, yeah.
Sorry, what date is that?
In June 1864.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said Wilfrid McDonald?
I said Wilfrid Laurier. I meant to say John A. MacDonald.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah. Was that what you guys were confused about too? Okay. All right. So, Sir John A. MacDonald is known today as... Are you guys okay? Is this confusing? It's good? Okay. So, John A. MacDonald today is known as the father of Confederation, the guy who organized the British North America Act of 1867. Now, as a father of Confederation, as a founding father of Canada, he's yet famous still for having said, at the end of his life, the last year of his life, where he was still Prime Minister, that a British subject I was born, and a British I will die. And actually, it's a British subject I will die. That's funny words for a founding father of a country. So, George Brown actually becomes the replacement of Isaac Buchanan in the following government and tries to undo pretty much everything Buchanan was fighting for, especially trade with the United States. Buchanan's whole policy was to use the customs union idea, right? So to actually unify the continent around free trade internally, as long as the principle was progress, so the investments into your infrastructure and science, but with a protective tariff around the continent to stop for the dumping of British cheap goods from their slave colonies in India and other places, which is the way the British then ran economic terrorism, and today, that's how they still run economic terrorism. So if you ask why are countries like India not developing, or a lot of other countries, it's because, you can't compete with Walmart. You can't compete with slave labor. So every time India or any country tries to create its own local industry in something, you can have, because the borders are open, the dumping of goods made somewhere even cheaper still. Let's say Africa, I don't know. But you could have the dumping of goods where that would crush any local industries that were trying to come alive. They did that in Canada too. We tried to have our own horseshoes being made here. It was crushed by just the flood of the product from overseas by Britain. And then we were punished. So this guy sabotages everything that Buchanan was fighting for. This guy is a mixed bag. Him as an individual is a racist, eugenics-loving psychopath. But because America's success was so pronounced after the Civil War, and the American system was being adopted by Russia's Tsar Alexander II in developing Russia, in Germany, in developing the Zollverein to industrialize Germany, with rail developments from Berlin to Baghdad being planned to modernize the Ottoman Empire, in Japan for the Meiji Restoration. So all of these countries were all adopting, South America, they were all adopting the American system. It couldn't be blocked anymore. The British, they were so weak, they were about to collapse actually. They had to bend and actually allow for the progress, or else Canada was definitely going to say fuck you and just break away. Because you're going to watch your neighbor prospering and you're going to just suffer, and it's so easy just to do the same thing as they're doing. It's common sense. So under MacDonald, there was a protective tariff put into place. There was a transcontinental rail system, and there was industrialization. Most of this, though, was done by the allies of Buchanan, who had maintained influence within the next government of MacDonald. A lot of it was done subversively as well by the British to ensure that Canada wouldn't work more closely with America. Like in the case of British Columbia, why didn't they become another state of America when you had an annexation movement in British Columbia, which got a lot more support after Alaska was purchased by America in 1867, right? Alaska was purchased by America's allies, Tsar Alexander II, which was formerly Russian. $7 million, it was nothing. So they sold him this big chunk of land on the condition that William Seward, the guy who was also stabbed a bunch of times on the night that Lincoln was killed, who was the Secretary of the Secretary of State. He survived, luckily, and he goes on to buy Alaska in 1867 on the condition that BC becomes a state of America. Why? Well, what's occurring at this time? The transcontinental rail, 2 transcontinental rails are being planned are being invested in by Lincoln before he's killed. One is completed, one is not completed in the north. Tsar Alexander II is a big rail fan. I mean, you have Philadelphia rail companies building the Trans-Siberian Rail in Russia to connect, Russia coast to coast. That was supposed to fundamentally provide us the means to go to the Bering Strait and through it, and in through Canada to unite the continents. So this thing that LaRouche has been talking about for decades is not a new concept. This has been there since Alexander II. Sad thing was, and what did the British do in response to this dynamic? Well, on the one hand, they had to allow for Canada to develop and to express a Promethean spark, but on the other hand, they had to commit a lot of assassinations. So after Lincoln, you had 1880, Tsar Alexander II is blown up. A couple of months before him, President Garfield is shot and killed. Then you have a little bit later on McKinley, who's killed in 1902. You have the President of France, Sadi Carnot. Who else? Carnot? Yep. Otto von Bismarck is ousted. Sadi Carnot. Yep.
I was watching a documentary called 1932, the history of
the United States.
Yeah, the United States. And you can see that after the centennial in the United States, where they showed the American system to the whole world, like Germany, France, Russia, and Japan, they all started to take in the American system.
Yeah.
And with the railing, they would block the British trade by being able to trade between each other. Now the British would lose their control over the whole world, and that's when they started to just kill everyone.
Exactly. Bismarck was ousted too. Exactly. And so that was the thing. All of these leaders had to be ousted, not just because they represented the American system for progress and development, but also because they were all blocking Britain's desire to blow up everybody and have everybody who were allies to kill each other, which is what was the effect of World War I. Now, in this period, the British are remobilizing themselves, and this is going to be where I'm going to slowly prepare the segue for the next class in a couple of weeks, which you guys should come back to. But before that, the British are remobilizing by creating something at the time known as the Round Table Movement. Now, the Round Table Movement is set up by a grouping of people around Nathan Rothschild, and a grouping of people around him, including Thomas Huxley, the whole X-Club that Huxley founds to promote British empiricist science against the real European, or what's called continental science, which was based on Leibniz and Kepler and people who made real discoveries, whereas the British, and that weren't simply using their senses, they were using their minds. The British school of Huxley, which promoted Darwin, he's known as Darwin's bulldog, that promoted all of these groupings who you could look at on even Wikipedia, but basically all of these guys said, no, the mind doesn't exist. All science is observation with your 5 senses and description, and that's all it is. So these guys, with Nathan Rothschild, with a grouping of people who made a name for themselves, like Lord Milner, in suppressing the Transvaal uprising in South America, which was at that point a Republican uprising to break, it was a Dutch colony, but it was trying to break free of the British, and it was subverted in a really disgusting way by Milner's grouping, who were bureaucrats for the civil service of Britain at the time. They formed a group called Milner's Kindergarten with another guy in Africa who was a real bastard named Cecil Rhodes. Right? Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe, was named after this guy who was just wrong on so many levels. But they use Milner Rhodes' fund that he made off of raping Africa of its diamonds, and they set up something called the Roundtable Group. The Roundtable Group is created and is run by a Canadian who's the head of the family or one of the leading members of the Family Compact, which still exists and is still exercising control over Canada. It didn't disappear with 1840. It continued in another form, named George Parkin and George Grant. George Parkin runs the Roundtable Trust as of 1902 when it's created, and its whole purpose is to revive the British Empire because it's about to collapse. It can't compete with the American system globally. And their method is to say we're going to use Darwin as our base, empiricism as the core, and we're going to use this to justify a new world empire, a federation of all of the different parts of the empire under an imperial union. And that's their model. Milner is the most fanatic leader of this thing, and he's observing in 1909 in Canada the problem of Canada at the time, especially as it's being run by Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Wilfrid Laurier, who's a replacement of MacDonald, is a real patriot. This guy is an admirer of Lincoln. He's a fighter for progress. I mean, he's got a really bold vision that he's not permitted by the conditions of his time to really go that far with. But still, the man's fighting against the imperial policy. And he's about to achieve reciprocity with the United States. What Isaac Buchanan was fighting for, this idea of a customs union of the Americas, that's what Laurier was about to achieve with what's called the Reciprocity Treaty of 1911. That would have completely shut down the British Empire from its control of Canada. Now, Lord Milner, upon coming to Canada to try to figure out how to override this problem, observes something very insightful. And this is going to play a very key role for the next 100 years because his prodigies go on to become leading cultural and political controllers of Canada for the entirety of the century, including today. He writes, as between the three possibilities of the future, and he's writing back to one of his colleagues in the Round Table in Britain. 1, closer imperial union. 2, union with the US. And 3, independence. That's independence of Canada. I believe definitely that number 2, union with the US, is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states. This tendency is, therefore, in my opinion, rather to be encouraged, not only as a safeguard against Americanization, but as actually making, in the long run, for a union of all the Britons. This is in 1909. Now, he's saying here that there is something, right, about a fallacy embedded in Canadian nationalism which doesn't quite understand the bigger historical forces shaping it. And this is, so he identifies negatively a fear, right, that the strategic threat of the empire negatively is that that Canada unite more closely with the Americas, and positively he says we can use this quality of a fallacious nationalism, one that's not set on firm principles, to allow for a later co-partner state with the imperial system. Now, if you think again today, what's Conrad Black fighting for? What is he representing as a policy for Canada? Lord Conrad Black, that's his entire raison d'etre for a Canadian-Britain unity of the Commonwealths to control the world. Because, you know, and his whole point is the U.S. is about to collapse, Europe is gone, we need now a revived Commonwealth. And this is what the Queen has been saying with Copenhagen in 2009. You need a revived Commonwealth to control this one world system. So this guy's, we're going to go into his prodigies and the echoes of his strategizing in a couple of weeks. Wilfrid Laurier is very clear in his autobiography, one of his letters of 1911, as soon as he's ousted from his government, is very clear on this. That he writes, Canada, upon having lost his position as Prime Minister, Canada is now governed by a junta sitting at London, known as the Round Table, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Victoria, with Tories and Grits receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them on their respective parties. Very clear. Now, the Tories and Grits, that's basically the founder today of, the Grits are known as liberals. That's the founder of modern liberalism. Tories, that's conservatives. That's the founder of modern conservatism. Both of them are two fallacious extremes of one common imperial policy. It's a false dichotomy. And it always has been. The NDP comes out of a weird Fabian society outgrowth of these things, which then take over the Liberal Party. So what do we got? Under the leadership, when America is itself and is committed to principle and progress, Canada has expressed its Promethean identity in an ever more clear way. We've had examples like John Diefenbaker, who, even though he's a so-called political enemy with C.D. Howe, who was at that time the controller of the Liberal Party, they were both committed to working with John F. Kennedy, with Eisenhower, with Roosevelt on programs like the Avro Arrow, nuclear power, even exporting our technologies to Africa, to India, to Pakistan, which Canada did in the 1950s under the Colombo Plan. Diefenbaker had a vision with the development of the Canadian Arctic, not the way Harper is saying his Arctic vision is working out to militarize it against the Russians, but rather to create science cities, like in Nunavut. We don't have to have a military base in Nunavut. He actually had a policy for Frobisher Bay, which is the capital of Nunavut, to be a massive domed city with all of the amenities of modern-day Toronto. This is something which would involve working more closely with the Russians on developing your resources and creative potential in science together. You had W.A.C. Bennett was fighting to make headroads on developing basically the biggest hydroelectric projects in the west coast of Canada ever, with the Columbia River Treaty and the Two Rivers Policy, which all were part of a greater design that locked into the North American Water and Power Alliance, which people like John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy both endorsed. Touching on Quebec, Daniel Johnson Sr., who died in office along with his two predecessors, who all died prematurely in office while premiers of Quebec, was the leader fighting for the development of our hydroelectric power in Quebec. The Manicouagan, all of these things that give us cheap electricity in Quebec came from this guy uniquely. And it was his ability to do this that came from his collaboration with Charles de Gaulle. So what you've got is something which today you can still tap into, and as organizers we have to look for finding better and better ways to both find this Promethean principle inside of ourselves so that we can then better find it in others, in both policymaking circles, mayors, deputies, people on the street, and get everybody to take on this bigger challenge of thinking of themselves in a bigger historical light. Because today, if you look at it, the role we could play doesn't have to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership or CETA. It doesn't have to be militarization of the Arctic. We could actually be working on developing such projects that people like Henry C. Carey fought for, like the Bering Strait rail tunnel that would combine these continents in a common pursuit of rail development, high-speed, maglev, opening up new corridors and new science cities for development, and the North American Water and Power Alliance, which in some measure has already, in a sense, begun with W.A.C. Bennett's Columbia River Treaty in Peace River, but has never been finally fulfilled, to move all of to mitigate the crisis which is now coming on both the United States and in a more advanced form even in Mexico, which has no fresh water, to actually take the wasted water runoff in the Arctic and Alaska and Yukon, collect and move chunks of it, about 10% down into the continent where there is a lot of drought. People are going to die en masse and starve. Food production is going to be wiped out. And it could green the deserts and set a precedent for doing similar things with Africa. I mean, the lessons that you learn from terraforming not only have application for the world, but also for other planets too, in the long run, if you think about what other deserts exist in our solar system. Well, we know there's ice on Mars. We know that there's a certain electromagnetic field, there's a certain useful gravitational field, which is a little bit less, but still something that could potentially sustain human life in some not too distant future. Probably would want to have a lot of machinery up there way before we set people, but still, the principle of actually terraforming is something that, you know, normally we would have to wait millions of years for nature to do something like turning a desert green. Whereas human beings, if we're thinking in a Promethean way, we've already seen deserts being converted into green havens of food and forests in 10 years or less. You've got the Imperial Valley of California, which is one of the major food producers of vegetables, right? Which was a complete desert before Roosevelt. So there's examples where the mind of man is actually proven to be, if it's obedient to natural law, an agency of the creativity that we find in the universe, but we can make it move faster and better. And it's more beautiful because it's self-conscious, because we had to actually overcome obstacles that were preventing this from happening inside of ourselves. So there's a free will element too. We can choose not to do that as well. And you know, as we've seen from Canada's experience, that's happened a lot, where people have chosen to take the easy path and have suffered in the long run. So I would just say I would leave it there for some questions, and you know, next, I guess not next week or the week after, but in 3 weeks we should do part 2 of this class.